God has forgiven me. I have nothing against anyone. I am ready to go. I am one in the number. I am ready to meet my God.
Today's case is one of Georgia's most infamous, and until recently, it has been considered the state's best-kept secret. Now, today's case centers on a woman whose life and death highlight both the racial and gendered inequalities that were embedded in the state's legal system and our state's history. Lena Baker remains the only woman who was ever executed by the electric chair in Georgia, and she was Black. To understand how this could happen, it's important to consider Georgia's history. While the colony initially banned slavery, that prohibition was later repealed, and Savannah actually became a major port in the Atlantic slave trade. And then, by the 19th century, Georgia's economy relied heavily on enslaved labor, shaping social and legal systems that marginalized Black people for generations. And against this backdrop, Black women faced unique vulnerabilities under both racial and gender discrimination. Legal historians note that during the early and mid-20th century, Black women were disproportionately exposed to exploitative labor practices, limited legal protections, and harsh sentencing compared to their white counterparts. Lena Baker's story illustrates these intersecting forms of bias. Her trial and execution reflect the systematic inequalities that existed in Georgia at the time. And decades later, the state formally acknowledged the injustice that she suffered, ultimately her death. Her execution remains controversial to say the least today, and her life and trial continue to be studied as part of Georgia's legal and social history. The gavel fell over 75 years ago, but Lena Baker's name endures, and her story offers a critical window into the challenges that Black women faced under a system shaped by both racism and sexism. Because one thing is certain, when your fate is sealed, there's no turning back. The gavel has fallen. I'm Nichole Mondshein, and this is Final Judgment, a deep dive into the final days, last choices, and chilling moments before execution on Georgia's death row. Some convictions unravel while some sentences are overturned. The evidence has been laid bare, the jury has spoken. But was justice truly served? For some, there's no appeal, no second chances, just the final judgment. But for others, the final judgment isn't so final after all. Lena Baker was born on June 8, 1900, the turn of a brand new century, in the small rural community of Cotton Hill, just outside Cuthbert, a city in Randolph County, Georgia. It's here where she was born into a family of sharecroppers, Black laborers who worked someone else's land for scraps, just trying to survive in a system built to keep them at the bottom. Lena had a brother and two sisters, and from a young age, they all had to work just as hard as their parents to help the family afloat. She was born into poverty, and from the very beginning, she knew life wasn't going to be easy. Not only was it because she was poor, but she was a Black woman living at the tail end of the 19th century. Back a time when Black people still weren't seen as equal citizens. In many cases, not even seen as people, just property. No rights, no protection, no voice. Her mother, Queen Harris, was the daughter of enslaved people. That's how close the history of slavery was. It lived in Lena's home, in her bloodline, not just in textbooks. A few years later, after she was born, Lena's family moved into Cuthbert, where they continued working as farm laborers, chopping and picking cotton for a white man named J.A. Cox. Lena was taught to read and write at an early age, but ended up dropping out of school by the 6th grade to help her family work the land. After working tirelessly and endlessly to help her family survive, Lena and a friend opened a lewd house where they would entertain men of all races, similar to what we now call a brothel. In 1920, Lena would even spend several months in jail after being convicted of prostitution. By the 1940s, Lena had 3 children of her own. She lived with them and her mother in a small rundown shack in Cuthbert, scraping by the best she could. She worked as a maid, cleaning houses and washing clothes, doing whatever it took to put food on the table. She was determined to give her kids the best life she could, but like so many Black women of her time, she was a victim of the system. Then one day she thought she had finally caught a break. She was offered work caring for an elderly white man named Ernest Knight. It felt like a step up, closer to nursing, something with a little bit more dignity, more stability than domestic labor. And for a Black woman in the Jim Crow South, this kind of opportunity was rare, and Lena believed that she had lucked out, that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. The job of taking care of Ernest Knight seemed like a windfall. Author Leila Bond Phillips wrote in her 2001 book, The Lena Baker Story, said, "Maybe, she told her mother, her luck was about to change." But that so-called opportunity turned out to be a trap, one that would ultimately lead to her demise. The man she was hired to care for would go on to abuse her, control her, and hold her against her will. And when Lena finally stood up for herself, when she acted in self-defense, something we now call a legal right, something we consider a legal right, she was not protected by the law. Because back then, Black women weren't given the benefit of self-defense. They weren't believed, they weren't protected, they weren't even seen. Her act of survival, of trying to protect her own life, would become the very thing that sealed her fate. And that fate was death. Ernest Knight owned and operated a grist mill and had recently broken his leg. And that's why he hired Lena, not just to care for his property, but to help nurse him back to health as well. Lena began working for Ernest in 1941, and what was supposed to be a fresh new start, a new chapter, quickly turned into something dark and sinister. At first, things seemed manageable. She got into the rhythm of working on his property. She began to feel a bit more comfortable in this role. But once her guard was down, Ernest began to sexually assault her. Repeatedly. He would even hold Lena captive in his home for days at a time, against her will. Now remember, this was well after the abolition of slavery in the United States. Legally, Lena wasn't Ernest's property, but in his mind, and in the eyes of many during this time, she might as well have been. He acted with the same entitlement, the same cruelty, and faced no immediate consequences. So what was supposed to be a job, a step up from the back-breaking domestic labor that she had been doing, became her prison. Still, Lena stayed. Not because she wanted to, but because she had mouths to feed. She sucked it up and endured the abuse, holding on to whatever strength and hope she had left for the sake of her children. Ernest was known around town as a pistol totter, a man with a temper who carried a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. Eventually, word of his so-called relationship with Lena spread throughout the small community. But what people didn't understand, or maybe chose not to see or chose not to understand, was that this wasn't a relationship at all. It was rape. It was forced. It was coercion. Lena didn't have a voice. She didn't have the power to say no. She had no protection under the law. But none of that mattered to the townspeople. Intimate, especially sexual relationships between Black and white people were simply not tolerated, no matter the context. Even though Lena was the one being violated, she was also the one being judged. Disgusted by this so-called relationship, Ernest's own son even took matters into his own hands and actually beated Lena brutally. But through all of this, Lena endured. She suffered in silence, held captive in more ways than just one. And still, she stayed, because she had children. And in a world stacked entirely against her, Lena Baker bore the unimaginable, just to keep food on the table for the people who she loved most.
You got to stay away from Mr. Elliott. He ain't no good. Everybody in town know that. He gonna kill you.
Mama, no!
That is, until things escalated on April 30th, 1944. That night, an argument erupted between Ernest and Lena. And in the heat of the confrontation, Ernest threatened to hit Lena with an iron bar. And it was in that moment when she realized the danger that she was in, that Lena tried to escape. She knew that if she didn't flee, she was going to die, that she would never see her children ever again. She knew that her children would lose their mother. The day before, Ernest had come to Lena's home, taken her back to his mill, and kept her prisoner there all day long. Throughout the day, Ernest demanded that Lena have sex with him, but Lena refused. And that's when he picked up the pipe, approaching her with violence in his eyes. As she tried to flee, Lena made a desperate attempt to grab Ernest's pistol, hoping it would give her a slight chance just to escape. But in the ensuing struggle, while fighting over the gun, Lena managed to seize it. In that moment, she fatally shot Ernest in the head. She knew that if she didn't act, she wouldn't survive. It was self-defense. Lena had no choice. It was either her life or Ernest's. And in that instant, she chose to survive. Ernest's Mill, the place where he took his last breath, still actually stands today, though just barely. It's located just a block and a half from the town square in Cuthbert. The mill is in ruins now, but its broken walls and shattered bottles serve as a dark reminder. This isn't just a part of Georgia's distant past. It's a part of the town's history. History the county tried to keep hidden for as long as they could. And although the mill has been forgotten by many, the shack with its blue door still stands, a silent witness to the night that changed everything. A night that would leave an indelible mark on Georgia's history. After Lena survived the altercation, she never once lied about what actually happened that night. She did admit to killing Ernest, but again, only because she was defending herself. But the law didn't care about her reasoning. She was a black woman. She killed a white man who had been her employer. And in the eyes of the law and the public, her fate was already sealed. Her guilt was assumed before the gun even went off. She was guilty of murder, no questions asked. Lena immediately reported the incident to J.A. Cox, the county coroner who had previously employed her and her family, hoping he would show some mercy or understanding. She believed he might be lenient, or at the very least, give her a chance to explain her side of the story, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Soon after, Lena was charged with capital murder and would stand trial. The trial convened on August 14, 1944 in Randolph County under the jurisdiction of Judge Charles William Two Gun Worrell. That nickname was given to him because he presided with two pistols on the bench, a stark reminder of the power he held over the accused and a chilling threat to the public. Her trial only lasted one day, literally 4 hours to be exact. Lena would testify explaining that although Ernest had forced her to accompany him in the public, she knew their relationship was despised by the townspeople. She had been warned multiple times by the county sheriff and Ernest's son to stay away from him or risk being sent to jail. But Lena, who was terrified of Ernest, terrified of both the physical and sexual abuse he subjected her to, she felt she had no choice but to obey his demands. Lena testified that the night before the fatal altercation, she managed to escape Ernest and slept in the woods. But the next day, Ernest kidnapped her once again. And by that point, enough was enough. Lena told him that she was leaving, which then led to the deadly confrontation. In her testimony, Lena described how Ernest would lock her in the mill house while he went to church. Upon his return, he would bring her food, but refused to let her leave. "Do what I tell you to do or I'll kill you," Lena claimed Ernest told her. "I believe he would have killed me if I had not done what I did." However, Lena's trial wasn't fair from the start. The jury was made up of entirely white men, and they had already decided her fate long before her testimony even began. Like I said, she had killed a white man, one of their own. There was no chance for her to be heard. She had no witnesses for her defense. The plea of self-defense she made was quickly rejected. The jury finalized their decision in less than 30 minutes, and by the end of the day, Lena was convicted of capital murder, which carried an automatic death sentence. The judge sentenced her to execution. Lena would be fatally electrocuted. The unfairness went beyond the all-white jury. The racial discrimination in Georgia, the lack of jury representation, and the failure of her legal defense all contributed to Lena's inability to receive a fair trial. It was a clear example of the systematic racism that Black citizens faced in Georgia during that time, a state that had disenfranchised Black people and imposed legal segregation for decades. The exact courtroom where Lena was tried is still standing to this day, reminding us about the injustices imposed on the Black community in the not-so-distant past. Despite her conviction, the governor granted Lena a 60-day reprieve so that the Board of Pardons and Parole could review the case. However, in January 1945, the board denied her clemency. Lena was transferred to the Georgia State Prison at Reidsville on February 23, 1945, to await her execution, which was scheduled for March 5, 1945. Lena continued to proclaim her innocence up until her death. Her final words, still recorded today, reflect the injustice that she faced, and she had accepted her fate. She knew that no matter how much she pleaded her case, the public would never truly hear her side. But through it all, Lena found peace in her faith and accepted her fate. Her last words were, "What I done, I did in self-defense, or I would have been killed myself. Where I was, I could not overcome it. God has forgiven me. I have nothing against anyone. I picked cotton for Mr. Pritchett, and he had been good to me. I am ready to go. I am one in the number. I am ready to meet my God. I have a very strong conscience. Lena was executed by electrocution on March 5th, 1945, and was pronounced dead just before 11:30 a.m. at the age of 44. To this day, she remains the only woman in Georgia's history to be executed by the electric chair. And at the time of her execution, the Georgia prison system was under scrutiny for reform. It happened so fast, and nobody was raising a fuss or saying this is not right. John Kolvidika, an Athens-based social justice activist, said. They put her in jail, prosecuted her, killed her, and she was forgotten about. It's believed that it took several shocks to fatally kill Lena, and she died after 6 minutes in the electric chair. And even in death, Lena's reputation was scrutinized. The local newspaper reported her execution with the headline, "Baker Burns," a chilling, grotesque reminder that no one, other than her family, seemed to care at all about the true story of what happened. The only focus was on the death of a white man and the killer being a black woman. Before her execution, Lena's hair was shaved off, a chilling and deeply morbid part of the process to ensure the electrical shocks would have a clear and uninterrupted path to her body. This act, while grimly practical for the executioners, underscores the dehumanizing nature of the judicial practices of the time. It serves as a stark, haunting reminder of just how inhumane the system was, reducing Lena's identity and humanity to nothing more than a mechanical procedure. But the story doesn't end there. After her execution, the local community's reaction took an even more disturbing turn. In a grotesque display of cruelty veiled as a twisted form of charity, elementary school students, young, impressionable children, were instructed to cut their hair to create a wig for Lena's body to be buried in. Just imagine that, the image of innocent children unaware of the deeper implications of their actions, cutting their hair to prepare a wig for a woman who had just been executed, is a heart-wrenching symbol of how deeply this tragedy impacted the entire community, and how the line between innocence and brutality was tragically blurred. This act, in its own right, reflects the dark, horrific reality of how racial injustice was not just a part of the system, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life, affecting even the most vulnerable in ways that left permanent scars on history. Lena was buried in an unmarked grave behind the Mount Vernon Missionary Baptist Church, located on a country highway outside of Cuthbert, Georgia, the same church where she had once sung in the choir. And even in death, she was denied respect, with her grave remaining unmarked for over 40 years. It wasn't until 1998 that a group of concerned church members actually finally placed a marker on her grave. Just a simple headstone, recognizing Lena's final resting place. Execution by hanging was abolished by the Georgia General Assembly in 1924, making electrocution the only legal form of execution in the state until lethal injection replaced it as the primary method of capital punishment in 2000. The last execution by electrocution in Georgia took place in 1998. And 3 years later, the Georgia Supreme Court ruled the electric chair unconstitutional. Georgia's first electric chair, morbidly nicknamed Old Sparky, was built and installed at the Georgia State Prison in Milledgeville in 1924. Then, in 1938, it was moved to the newly constructed Georgia State Prison in Reedsville. Over the years, Old Sparky claimed the lives of over 400 men and one woman from 1924 to 1980, averaging nearly 70 executions per year. Over 80% of those victims were Black. And that one woman was Lena, the only woman executed in the state during the 20th century. The old death chamber at the state prison in Reedsville has since been restored to its original condition. Visitors can actually now tour the area, which includes Old Sparky, the generator that powered it, the switchboard, the embalming room, death row cells, and the recreation area known as the Last Mile. Also on display is a black and white photograph of Lena, taken the day she was signed into the prison, with her last words typed underneath it. This one photo of Lena, her mugshot, is the only known photograph of Lena Baker. In the photo, you can see her scarf, tied beneath her chin, covering her head. She's just staring blankly at the camera, with the number 11279. Maybe it's this moment she accepted her outcome, her fate, her death. To this day, Lena's name is still mentioned throughout the city of Cuthbert, but her story is also known across the country. 60 years after her death, in 2005, Lena Baker was finally posthumously pardoned by the state of Georgia. While the pardon came too late, it does mark a critical acknowledgement of the state's grave error in denying her clemency and ultimately executing her, failing her. Lena's family and descendants finally received the justice that she deserved. A justice long overdue. The shame tied to her name left a lasting legacy on the city, but for her family, this pardon brings some measure of closure. It serves as a powerful reminder of the horrors Lena and so many other Black individuals endured, helping to educate new generations about these dark chapters of history. For years, relatives fought for the Georgia state legislature to clear Lena's name, pushing for the recognition and justice that had been denied to her for decades. The document, signed by all 5 board members, acknowledges that the parole board's 1945 decision to deny Lena clemency and admit that her execution was a grievous error and that the case called out for mercy. Roosevelt Curry, Lena Baker's great-nephew, expressed that it took far too long for the state to recognize the critical mistake that ultimately cost his great-aunt her life. "It's the right thing," he said. "They can give me all the papers they want, but you cannot, remember that, you cannot mend a broken heart." But the state's recognition of this error, he continued, does bring some form of closure. Now we can all cry tears of joy. She had nothing, and no one stood by her. It's late, but it's on time. This case was passed to me, and I can pass it on to my family, he said. Mr. Curry's pursuit of his great-aunt's posthumous rehabilitation was supported by John Kolvedika, director of the Prison and Jail Project, a prison advocacy group. It's gratifying to see that this blatant instance of injustice has finally been recognized for what it was, a legal lynching, he said. Her legacy will always be that she was a symbol of a racially unjust system. She is one of those folks who we need to remember and know what happened to. However, the parole board did not see the pardon as a blow against racial injustice or a correction of a historical wrong. "We just felt that this was a situation that was unique," Garland Hunt, the vice chairman of the parole board, said. "We felt it was a good thing to do for the family. We're not saying she's innocent. As a matter of fact, the board did not find Lena Baker was innocent of this crime. The pardon suggested that Lena could have been charged with voluntary manslaughter, a charge that typically carries an average sentence of 15 years in prison. Lena's family and supporters maintained that her charge should have been reduced to manslaughter, asserting that Ernest's death was an accident. This was not a white or Black issue. It was an issue of right or wrong, one of Lena's great-great-nephews said. Roosevelt Curry, who was instrumental in helping clear Lena's name, never knew his great-aunt, but her story haunted him and his family for years. He understood the significance of her legacy, not just for their family or the state of Georgia, but for Black women and Black people across the country. He knew his great-aunt deserved justice. Roosevelt felt compelled to be the voice that she was never given, the advocate Lena never had, during a time of rampant segregation and racial injustice. "It hurts me the way she was mistreated. She didn't have anybody to help her but God. I feel good about the dedication. You have to tell the truth. Wrong ain't never going to win nothing," he said. It's only been the 3rd posthumous pardon granted in the agency's history. Roosevelt believes his great-aunt Lena was somewhere around God's throne and can look down and smile after the pardon. In 2011, after a decade of efforts by Lena's descendants to clear her name, a new headstone was dedicated in her honor at the Mount Vernon Baptist Church Cemetery, where she is buried. "When we first started this campaign 10 years ago, there were only 5 or 10 people with us," Roosevelt Curry said at the dedication ceremony. "Now look at all these people here. But when we started, I said, ain't nobody gonna stop us from getting justice for Lena Baker." An aide to U.S. Representative Sanford Bishop Jr. d'Albany read this statement at the memorial. "Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to Lena Baker. Today, her family dedicates her tombstone 65 years after she was laid to rest at the Mount Vernon Baptist Church in Cuthbert, Georgia. Mr. Speaker, it is my hope that the dedication of her tombstone today can heal the wounds of the past. May Lena Baker now truly rest in peace." And Lena's legacy continues to live on to this day, and more people across the world are hearing about her story thanks to the 2008 film, The Lena Baker Story, a feature-length docudrama written and directed by Ralph Wilcox and distributed by Lionsgate Films. "There are plenty of tragedies out there that no one has ever heard of," the director said about making this movie. "This was one of them. We did not make this film to create divisiveness between Black and white folks. Lena's story is still relevant today. I hope that people don't view this as strictly a Black and white issue, but We need not forget where we've been, lest we repeat the past. I want people to regard this film as a story of a woman's life. As filmmakers, our job is to not only entertain, but also to enlighten and educate. And even though Lena was flawed, this film is an opportunity to give her the voice she was denied 64 years ago. Each and every one of us deserves that. There's also a book titled The Lena Baker Story, written by Leila Bond Phillips, an English professor at Andrew College, and it's available on Amazon. Since 2001, campaigners for Lena's innocence, as well as family members, have commemorated the date of her execution at her gravesite, even holding a Mother's Day ceremony there in 2003. Roosevelt still has a letter to this day from one of Ernest's great relatives, expressing regret that they couldn't have done something to help Lena. "I'm not angry at the whole world," Lena's great-nephew said. "I'm not even angry at E.B. Knight. Nobody knows what went on between them but them and God." Perhaps it was in those final moments when no one else stood by her that God was the only presence Lena could really rely on, offering the solace and justice the world had denied her. But unbeknownst to her, Lena's story would not go unnoticed, even though it did at the time. Her legacy will continue to live on and still does to this day around the world. Lena's story reminds us of a bygone era where racism and discrimination weren't just rampant in everyday life. They were embedded in the very fabric of the judicial system, a system that was supposed to offer fairness to all. But unfortunately, that fairness is often an illusion, and Lena's case is far from rare. The truth is, countless Black women face similar fates, unjustly accused, wrongly convicted, and denied the opportunity for mercy. Lena was not just a victim of her circumstances. She was a product of a broken system that was never meant to protect her or any woman like her. While we can praise the state of Georgia for acknowledging its wrongs, the responsibility falls on us to keep these stories alive, to ensure that what happened to Lena never happens again. Too many people, especially Black men and women, still face the threat of wrongful convictions. And according to the National Registry of Exonerations, over 50% of those exonerated for wrongful convictions are Black. The Georgia Innocence Project reports that nearly 2,000 innocent people are incarcerated currently in Georgia alone. This isn't just about historical injustice, it's a present-day crisis that demands action. Lena's story serves as a stark reminder of the racial disparities that persist in our judicial system, but it's also a call to action for all of us, especially women, to rise and speak out for our sisters. We cannot stand idly by. We must hold our society accountable, recognize the privileges and injustices that exist still to this day, and demand a better, more just world for everyone. State Representative Tyrone L. Brooks put it best: "I see a reawakening of elected and appointed officials to recognize the injustices of the past. We have a responsibility to correct those wrongs as much as we can. As a society, we must take ownership of our past in order to learn from it and improve. We have a responsibility to do better, judiciously and as human beings. We must stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, who are too often silenced by systems that were never meant to protect them in the first place." Lena's story is not just the story of one woman. It's the story of too many Black women who were never given the justice that they rightfully deserved. It's the story of women who lived in fear, knowing that speaking out could cost them everything. Lena's courage to stand up and speak the truth in a world that wasn't ready to hear it as a legacy we must carry forward. Now it's up to us. Women, especially, have a duty to stand up for our sisters, to break that silence, and to ensure our society can do better. The fight for justice isn't over. Lena's legacy will live on as a beacon for change, reminding us all that the final judgment may have been made, but her story and her legacy is far from over.